Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Breakdown with Berckenhoff, episode 29. It has been over a month since our last podcast, so I do have to apologize for that. I don't really have any excuses to share on why we haven't had any recent podcast episodes. So we don't have to run through that gauntlet, but I do apologize to anybody who may have been following weekly or listening to anything like that. But I am going to try to resume the podcast each week. Shouldn't take that much of a issue to do because it is something that I generally enjoy. We should be live on YouTube. We were banned on YouTube for a week for what I believe to be a copyright claim over a History Channel clip I played, potentially background music. Although the background music was copyright free, there could have been something in there that got copyrighted that from the playlist that we were listening to on that previous stream. So I'm just going to make sure that we are all live on our live stream platforms. But since this is a podcast, we won't pay too much attention to make sure all of our connections are good to go. As long as we are live and we can share what has been in the news over the last month since our previous podcast. It's been over a month, really. But we shouldn't necessarily be off YouTube or anything like that. I'm probably just going to make those sort of topic streams on my Twitch, Trovos, eventually Odyssey, and D-Live channels. But we will keep YouTube to the podcast, some solo videos if I end up making those, or other topic streams that aren't focused on videos and clips. So just keep your eyes out on for those if you do like my topic streams, but we will probably have to stay away from YouTube for those streams now, unfortunately. But I'm just going to check one thing real quick and then we can get into the news. We're going to be mainly focused over the major topics that we have missed in the news, but it is going to be mainly focused on the topics of this last week and the relevant news stories that are happening now in the news cycle. Those who are viewing live, you will be able to see all the articles. If you are viewing on the podcast, all of these articles will be linked in the channel description of the episode. So if any of the articles do interest you, you can go into that channel description and view it yourself. Or you can make sure you know what my sources are for each of the podcast episodes. We are part of a media group. We are going to be changing names recently and come up with a new site, but unfortunately that site is unavailable now. But you can definitely make sure to check out any of those content creators, such as J. Edgar101 on YouTube and Twitch, Stephen and Garamus, R-Rated Conservative, Generational Grap, The Freckles and Brit Show, and I don't think I missed any, but I do apologize if I have missed any of the content creators, but they are all really good content creators that I highly suggest following if you are interested in individual content creation from a everyday person's perspective and not so much from a elitist perspective that you find on mass media episodes on culture and news. So now that we got all of that out of the way, we can move on to our first news story. I thought we would start with something a little bit more lighthearted, and then we can get into more of the serious topics. But this is going to be an episode focused on the virus of the year and of last year. And unfortunately, it is still one of the major topics in the news, even though I think that the majority of us would appreciate if it wasn't that case. But unfortunately, it is, and we have to deal with the consequences of it for each week. And there has been various promotions for this virus. To try to get people to get the vaccine from it. There was promotions from Samuel Adams. There's promotions from various media companies and various just companies in general, trying to say if you get the virus, you get a free beer. Or if you get the virus, you get a free something. Just you get the idea of the promotions. But there's also been giveaways out of this virus, such as the Vax-A-Million campaign or Vax-A-Whatever campaigns that various states are doing. The idea being you can get a vaccine and be and have your name as part of a lottery system, and the names will eventually be drawn, and you will win a certain amount of money depending on when your name was drawn. That's basically the idea of the promotion, and to win a particular amount of money if you get chosen with your name. So you can see kind of the appeal to something like that. And because of it, there's numerous people that went ahead and most likely got the vaccine because of the promotion, or at least enticed them to get the vaccine because of the promotion. And that is the idea, that is the concept behind doing a promotion like this. Getting more people to be vaccinated, even if it takes something like a giveaways or promotions for certain materials. So, long story short, in Boston, there was a Massachusetts Vax-A-Million giveaway, and the person that won it got an interview from it, and on the top sub-headline quote, it says here, "I thought it was a scam." And we're just going to go on to read a little bit about this, because I thought it was something kind of semi-lighthearted to start off our COVID news stories. After getting their COVID-19 vaccine shots earlier this spring, 2 lucky Massachusetts residents received some life-changing money this week. Governor Charlie Baker announced the first 2 winners in the state Vax-A-Millions giveaway for fully vaccinated residents during a press conference on Thursday. Darrell Washington, a 63-year-old Blue Cross Shield case manager from Weymouth, won the first $1 million cash prize, and Daniel, a 15-year-old Chelsea resident, won the giveaway for a $300,000 scholarship grant, which is a significant amount of money there. Okay, we are good there. Good. However, Washington didn't pay any additional persuading. Both got the vaccine earlier this past spring, shortly before they came eligible. So there it goes to say that they didn't say that their motive for getting the vaccine was because of these giveaways, and that they were going to seek the vaccine when they were eligible. Everyone remembers, I don't necessarily think that anybody is going to be surprised, but everyone remembers that the initial rollout of this vaccine was done by age. I believe each state had the ability to make their own guidelines and to make their own procedures for who would get the vaccine first, second, third, fourth, fifth, so on, by age group or by prior existing health conditions. In other words, getting the people who are more likely to get it because of health reasons, the vaccine, blah, 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 blah. We all get the perspectives, but it was up to the states. So they say here in the article that they weren't persuaded by the giveaway necessarily to get the vaccine directly. But I still think that it doesn't go without saying that some people were probably persuaded by these giveaways to get the vaccine. I can't say that for certain or without, but it's just something interesting there. But we're going to go on to just read a few more quotes about this news story. "I just couldn't imagine me being a host for a virus and then getting them sick and crucially ill and possibly passing away," he said. "I just couldn't do that." Allotting to the misinformation and skepticism about the vaccine on TV, blah, 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 blah. Just really ask yourself, is your child, is your spouse, is your grandparents, are they worth you getting a vaccination, he said. "I mean, that risk seems to be very, very easy for me to resolve. I think you will too. If you care about them, you probably will do that." Again, hinting towards the sentiment and the idea that one of the major reasons you should get the coronavirus vaccine is because of protecting the people around you, even if you don't necessarily think it's going to be efficient or going to work in your case. It's still the idea that you should be the one to do this for the people in your life and the people around you, because that is what you should do. But we're going to just read a little bit more. The Chelsea High School resident said she initially couldn't believed when her mom told her she won the scholarship grant. "I thought it was a scam," she said, laughing. But as a low-income family in the city that has been through the hardest hit both by the virus and economic impacts of the pandemic in Massachusetts, she added that she was really happy to get the opportunity to go on to college. Even as just a sophomore, she said that she prospectively looking at Boston University and at the University of Massachusetts. So there we go, with just some lighthearted articles and ideas that people were having about the virus and everything like that. So it looks like we are all good on that. So good. We're going to go on to our next news story. Sorry about that. Something caught my eye, but it looks like we are still live, so we can keep going here as we wait for our next video to come up. This next video was a very popular clip, what was going around the internet and all of the news cycle really last week, and even the start of this week in a large part. Was an exchange between Rand Paul and Dr. Anthony Fauci. Even though Ron Paul, who has his podcast, The Liberty Report, has been very harsh against Fauci and his claims, being a doctor himself. But that's not ultimately the main focus. The main focus is with Rand Paul, who is his son, who has been a somebody who's asked Anthony Fauci, Dr. Fauci, a lot of very tough questions throughout this whole cycle in the news. He was a person same as Thomas Massie, who was from the House. Senator Rand Paul is from the Senate, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, the Senate. And he's part of the Health Committee, and that's why he's been getting a lot of rounds recently and everything like that. And Thomas Massie, who is a part of the House, is somebody who's also said a lot of similar things to Senator Rand Paul. He just hasn't necessarily had the media attention or people around him necessarily, because he is a part of the House and not a part of the Senate. But long story short, what I'm getting at, what they're both saying, I should probably say that first, because people are probably thinking, what is he talking about here? What I'm saying here is that they both said that if you have gotten the COVID virus, and I know that Thomas Massie did and Rand Paul did, that you shouldn't have to wear a mask inside the White House, because it makes no sense, because you then have immunity of the virus because you already have had the virus. So their whole idea is that you shouldn't necessarily have to wear a mask because you have immunity from previously already having the virus. And long story short, they both kind of said that, and they both have been very harsh against Anthony Fauci's claims of double masking despite having the virus, and many other things that Fauci has said and then decided not to keep going from, and other topics like that. But you kind of get the whole premise. Anybody that's followed the COVID news cycle even a little bit has probably seen some exchanges between Rand Paul and Anthony Fauci. And this one was their latest of the exchange, and really probably their most heated exchange that they have had yet. And I'm going to let the video speak for itself, but we are going to quickly adjust our settings for anybody who is viewing live so that we can see this video in the most practical way here. Alrighty, so that looks good. We'll make sure that the volume is on for us to hear it, and we'll let the video talk, and we'll pause a little bit here and there so that hopefully we'll avoid any copyright strikes going forward on the YouTube channel. But before this, Dr. Rand Paul, our Senator Rand Paul, was talking about that it's that it's wrong to lie to the Senate, and you could potentially have a major fine or a jail sentence off of lying to the Senate because they rely on your information and other informations to go off of. So it's very important that you are honest with them. So Senator Rand Paul was talking about an article that was in a website/journal from a doctor who was saying that this was the only way that this would be possible would be if it was scientifically manipulated through the research technique that Anthony Fauci was saying that was not involved, and the NIH didn't give them information for, didn't give them more money for, blah 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 blah. So he was talking about this doctor that wrote in the paper, gain to function. That's what I was looking for. Gain to function was the research that the doctor was talking about. And she, in this paper, thought that that was the only way possible. And at the time, Anthony Fauci said it wasn't. And blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of the background to this clip. And then we're going to get into the parts that kind of became the most popular off of this. And I see you there, Jimmy. Hopefully you're having a good afternoon so far. But we will play out this clip. Hang on here. We need to adjust our settings. 1 second, everybody. Alrighty, now we should be able to hear it nice and good. Sorry about that. Let's just back up just a little bit and we'll play this again.
Of gain of function research done in
Alrighty, we're gonna let it load. Alright, here we go.
Entirely in Wuhan, for which there was supposed to be a federal pause. Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement of May 11th where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain of function research in Wuhan?
Your microphone.
Senator Paul.
So before Anthony Fauci, Dr. Fauci, whatever name you want to give him, and I keep saying both because why not? Anyway, before he gives us response, you can tell just by body language, if you are watching live, that Dr. Fauci is extremely upset with this question. And you could say that it's because he thinks it's an outright lie, outright slander. You could say it's because he may be nervous because of the question. Whatever reason you give, you can tell that he is very frustrated. And everybody who's been to these Senate hearings or anything like that knows that it's a push-to-talk mic. And you push it and you can speak, and then when you're finished you push the button again and it turns the mic off, and that allows it a lot easier way so that you can talk to maybe the people around you if it's in a hearing or you have lawyers or whatever the case may be, and it won't pick up on the mic. So there's a reason that the mics are set up in that way. And Dr. Fauci at this point has probably been spoken to in front of the Senate, in front of the House, in front of a bunch of committees, right? And has known that this is the procedure of doing so. So the fact that he forgot to push the motor could say, well, he's a boomer, he's old. That's the reason that he forgot. But I think he kind of lost that since this is at least his 50th time in front of the Senate. Maybe not in front of that committee per se, but in front of the Senate or type of government officials, and they all work the same way. So you can just tell that he is very frustrated with this question before he gives his response, and I think you can very much hear that in the response he gives.
I have never lied before the Congress, and I do not retract that statement. This paper that you are referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain of function. Let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans, right. You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And
so you see that Senator Rand Paul interrupts Fauci in his comments here, and it's I think important to do this because usually with these hearings they're very civil. It's almost like a formal debate structure. You let the person speak, you then question them. You let the person speak, you then question them. You speak, the person answers your questions, or maybe you end with you speaking, saying, committee members, blah 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 blah. I yield the rest of my time. We all have seen this before. At least people who have paid attention to hearings, maybe not just COVID hearings, but the big tech hearings that happened recently, or even the investigation of Brett Kavanaugh during his whole time of becoming a Supreme Court justice. But they all work the same. And yes, they can be heated between members, and sometimes interruptions do happen, but usually they are kept very civil. When you see Dr. Rand Paul interrupt Dr. Fauci, or Senator Rand Paul interrupt Dr. Fauci, and that probably makes Dr. Fauci even more annoyed. And then they're going to go on to argue about what the term of gain-to-function research means. And that's ultimately what this clip is coming out of. Dr. Fauci has a different version or a different definition of what gain-to-function research would be, while Senator Rand Paul has a different definition.
Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly, and I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about. You get one person.
Let's read from the NIH definition of gain of function. This is your definition that you guys wrote. It says that scientific research that increases the transmissibility among mammals is gain of function.
And yes, he did say manimals, not mammals, manimals, which I thought was kind of funny. Not that needs to be the major focus from that clip, but we can have a laugh here or there. So I just thought that was pretty funny myself. But once again, they're arguing over the definition of gain to function. And those who are not viewing this clip live, when you heard Dr. Fauci kind of interruptish over Senator Paul when he was speaking there, it was to talk directly to the person who is leading this hearing, because he thought that he was interrupted and didn't have time to finish his question, even though he was being very accusatory of Dr. Fauci in his response. Or Rand Paul was being. Both of them are being accusatory towards each other there. But I think that is also something to be mentioned. But we'll just let this clip play a little bit more. Oops. Sorry about that, everybody. There we go.
They took animal viruses that only occur in animals, and they increased their transmissibility to humans. How you can say that is not gain of function?
It is not.
It's a dance, and you're dancing around this because you're trying to obscure responsibility for 4 million people dying around the world from a pandemic.
And let's let Dr. Fauci.
I have to. Well, now you're getting into something. If the point that you are making is that the grant that was funded as a sub-award from EcoHealth to Wuhan created SARS-CoV-2, that's where you are getting. Let me finish.
We don't know.
Well,
we don't
wait
know
a minute.
If it did come from the lab, but all the evidence is pointing that it came from the lab, and there will be responsibility for those who funded the lab, including yourself.
I totally
This committee will allow the witness to respond.
I totally resent the lie that you are now propagating, Senator, because if you look at the viruses that were used in the experiments, that were given in the annual reports, that were published in the literature, it is molecularly impossible.
No one's saying those viruses caused it.
It is molecularly.
Those viruses caused the pandemic.
So it's important to note that in this video, for those who are listening to this live, or who are listening to this as a podcast, I should say, when Rand Paul interrupts Dr. Fauci in his last stance, the Senate hearing person who's leading this is giving Dr. Fauci the last word. So Senator Rand Paul should not be speaking here. And the fact that Senator Rand Paul is speaking suggests that probably makes Dr. Fauci even more mad, because he is supposed to have the last word in this, and he is supposed to end up finishing what he's been trying to say already. So you can kind of see how this is building up, but Senator Rand Paul is wanting to prove a point, and he wants to make sure that Dr. Fauci knows exactly the point that he is proving. And right now, you have Dr. Fauci's finger kind of raising up and pointing at Senator Rand Paul and maybe the committee as a whole in him trying to get this last word out. And we're going to listen to the rest of it and how he ultimately ends this confrontation between himself and the senator.
Pandemic. What we're alleging is that gain-of-function research was going on in that lab, and NIH funded it.
That is
you can't
not...
get away from it. It meets your definition, and you are obfuscating the truth.
I'm not obfuscating the truth.
Senator
You are the
Paul's
one.
time is expired, but I will allow the witness to...
Let me just finish. I want everyone to understand that if you look at those viruses, and that's judged by qualified virologists and evolutionary biologists, those viruses are molecularly impossible
No one's
to
saying
result
they are. No
in
one's saying those viruses
SARS-CoV-2.
caused the pandemic.
Senator Paul,
We're saying they are gain-of-function viruses because they were
They're not.
animal viruses that became more transmissible in human, and you funded it.
And you
won't admit the truth.
And you
Senator
implying...
Paul, your time has expired, and I will allow witnesses who come before this committee to respond.
And you are implying that what we did was responsible for the deaths of individual. I totally resent
could
that.
have
And
been.
if anybody
And it
is
could have been.
lying here, Senator, it is you.
So when he ends there, again, for those who are listening to this as a podcast, he directly points to Senator Rand Paul and says, "You're the one that is lying, not me." And again, as throughout this whole video clip, you have them two interrupting each other, with Dr. Fauci kind of interrupting Senator Paul at the start, and Senator Paul interrupting Dr. Fauci towards the end of that clip, which I think is kind of interesting as well. But that was the clip that was very famous, and this is linked in the channel description if you're listening to this as a podcast or if you're listening to this as a live version. You can find this clip in its entirety if you want to listen to it without interruptions. But we do have to give my commentary over this since it is a podcast and since we don't want to get copyright struck again by our good old YouTube. But we do have a clip to kind of introduce our next topic and most recent news story coming out of the government or coming out of COVID and relating to the new CDC guidelines of masking once again. And those who are on the comment section on Twitch, I do not want to become famous and buy followers. Thank you for that, but unfortunately that is not my main goal for today. And we'll let this clip.
I know this is slightly awkward timing, and I know there's a lot of reporting out there about the CDC guidance. It is not only...
We're going to pull this back, and this was a reporter asking a question about the CDC guidelines and just wanting to know some more information.
Sure. Well, first, I know this is slightly awkward timing, and I know there's a lot of reporting out there about the CDC guidance. It is not only appropriate for them to make the decisions, it's also appropriate for them to officially announce their own guidance. I will say, though, that how we view this, as you asked about, Alex, implementation of their guidelines that they'll outline on a call with all of you later this afternoon, that we are still in the midst of a once-in-a-generation pandemic, battling an ever-evolving virus. We have said since the beginning of June that the Delta variant, a rising variant that had increasing, was clear from the beginning, had a great deal of transmissibility, was a threat to people who were unvaccinated. We did more than 100 interviews with officials conveying exactly that. And the reality is we are dealing with a much different strain of this virus than we were even earlier in the spring, back in May, when the masking guidance was done, provided by the CDC at that time. That is their job. Their job is to look at evolving information, evolving data.
Come on, there you go. I was trying to...
Evolving historic...
Stop. There you go. The good old pause button. Alrighty. So this is once again in response to the new guidelines off of the Delta variant that is happening that has recently gone up in cases around the world, in Canada and Britain and India, especially with, I think there's an Indian variant as well that was getting some attention. Or maybe this one is from India. I may have my facts slightly mixed up on the origins of the Delta virus link and what's happening, but what is known off of this or from this is that the Delta virus has been increasing in cases and is a very potent new strand, and the Biden administration, through Jim Paxi, Biden himself, and the CDC are suggesting new guidelines for indoor mask mandates, as well as mask mandates again because of the strength that the Delta variant is having now, which is kind of the response in what she's also given. And it is also important to note that the CDC recommendations are guidelines, and it's ultimately up to the states on if they want to perform these guidelines or not. And we're going to get into some articles over states that are going to increase on guideline restrictions and other topics relating to it, and states that are not. We know offhand that in Florida, the governor in Florida, Ron DeSantis, is suggesting that he does not want to implement any of these new CDC guidelines. Here in Texas, we have Governor Greg Abbott, and I don't think that I've heard any responses from Governor Abbott yet about these new CDC guidelines. But we're going to let the clip play just a little bit longer here.
Pandemic and provide guidance to the American public. That's exactly what they will do, and what they will provide specific details on later this afternoon.
With respect to the president's comments, though, do you, in retrospect, regret those comments? Do you think that that was wise at the time, considering, they could make it tougher for Americans to take this seriously?
Well, first I would say that in the president's remarks, he also made clear, and I'm quoting him, that today, while the virus hasn't been vanquished, he made clear that it was not over, that those who were unvaccinated.
I believe these remarks were in response to President Biden saying that the people who are responsible for this pandemic are the people that are not vaccinated. She's maybe talking about a different remark that the president made, but I believe that that was the remark that was gaining a lot of attention throughout this last week and past couple of days, because basically President Biden said the quiet out loud that a lot of people were thinking the Biden administration was wanting to say, or people in general were wanting to say, about the cases rising in the COVID strands and whatnot. So I believe that is in response to that question. And to answer Jimmy's questions up there, I knew that Washington, D.C. was most likely going to ask for a mask mandate. I would think that they would be one of the more harsher mask mandates to be available for areas and states. And I'm going back to the college, to SFA, at the end of August. August 22nd is, I believe, the move-in date that I'm going to move in from. So kind of middle August, end August, however you kind of want to view that. But we'll let the clip play a little bit more.
We're still at risk. He made clear that you were protected from serious illness, disease, or hospitalization if you were vaccinated. That remains the case, and he encouraged people who were not vaccinated to get vaccinated. But again, the role of the federal government and our public health officials is to continue to look at evolving data, evolving threats of a historic virus, provide that public health guidance to the American people to protect more people and save more lives. That's what they're doing.
So that was the clip there from the New York Post and Jim Paxi in response to the new CDC guidelines. This was on, nope, stop, we don't need autoplay. This was on July 27th, and I believe it is the 28th today. Wrong thing, 29th. So this was 2 days old as a clip, so there probably is some more newer information, newer clips based off of the CDC guidelines directly. But we're going to move on next to the NPR article here. Corvo Noro asked, have you heard the news? What news exactly are we talking about? Have we heard the news? Let's see. Yep. Alright, so this is NPR, and it just states where you live on if the vaccine is going to happen here. Corvo says Fauci is a new coming Christ. I'm not so sure if that is the case necessarily. Many people may want to listen to Fauci 100%. Many people don't want to listen to Fauci. He's more of a controversial figure. And he probably shouldn't be a controversial figure, but unfortunately that is the reality we live in. So here we go. With the Delta variant taking off in the U.S., the federal government announced Tuesday that it's updating its masking guidelines for fully vaccinated people. The new advice is to mask up indoors if you live in a place substantial or high coronavirus transmission. And by the way, Corvo says just like Jesus was, which is kind of true, kind of not, but that did make me chuckle a little bit, so thank you for that one. As you can see here, it has a map and an interactive figure on this NPR article where you can circle around your area or county you live in and see the risk that your county is at of transmission. And most of Texas is looking pretty dark red. Most of Florida is looking pretty dark red. Up here in the northern states, kind of northern east, it's looking more moderate than the dark reds, and there's literal whole states that are completely dark, such as Arkansas and Georgia and states there, which is rather interesting. And California is pretty mixed from moderate levels to low levels all the way up to high levels. So that is interesting, and it has a search bar where you can search the county that you are in now. But let's continue on and read, since we can't really look at an interactive figure on the podcast. That would get kind of boring. The change of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention masking guidelines came after pressures from many outside experts. The CDC director, Dr. Rochelle Winsley, said in a news briefing that the change comes after new evidence showed Delta was more transmissible than previously understood. This was not a decision that was taken lightly. She noted that new data from outbreak investigations show that rarely vaccinated people can still get infected and spread the virus to others. On rare occasions, unvaccinated people infected with the Delta variant after vaccination may be contagious and spread the virus to others. She told reporters when announcing the new guidelines, "This new science is worrisome and unfortunately warrants an update to our recommendations." The data from the map of the CDC is updated regularly. The color coding is based on two metrics: the number of new cases per 100,000 residents and the percentage of coronavirus tests that come back positive in a 7-day period. A high positivity rate indicates that the number of infections in a place may be high and that more testing needs to be done. If those metrics show different levels of transmission in a given place, the CDC selects the higher level. Nearly 2/3 of the counties in the country are experiencing substantial or high transmission as of late July. The CDC classifies a community as having substantial transmission if there are 50 to 99 weekly cases per 100,000 residents, or if the positivity rate is between 8 and 9.9 in the last 7 days. So it goes on to talk a little bit more about that, and we'll read the ending of this article here. She continues to emphasize the need for more people to get vaccinated, nothing that the areas with the lowest vaccination rates are getting hit hardest. With the recent wave with the Delta variant, she said vaccinating more Americans now is more urgent than ever. So throughout this article, it mentions that places that have low vaccination rates or low vaccination areas are becoming more are having higher case numbers. So she's seeing a correlation between the vaccine and the correlation between cases, or I should say the vaccination percentage of the county to the percentage of people who are affected in the county. And as it mentioned in the article, it is rare for people that have received the vaccine to get the virus again. Or it's even rare to have the virus and get the virus again. So both ways are kind of rare, but especially getting the vaccine and then getting the virus is rare. If you have followed the news, you do know that there are some cases where that has existed, where people have gotten 1 dose of the virus, or in some cases 2 doses of the vaccine, and have still gotten the virus again, or gotten the virus the first time. Those are some cases out there, but the percentages are extremely low. But it is important enough to note, but she's basically saying that she can see a rate between the percentage of people vaccinated in the county to the percentage of people that are affected. So you can go about that and that is why the CDC suggested the new vaccine mandates are not new vaccine mandates, well, they are kind of vaccine mandates, but new mask mandates to be in the news and be required. We'll go to our Fox News article here. Randy Runnington ripped after telling NSNBC we are going to try to reopen schools after the CDC mask mandates. American Federation of Teachers president was ripped after hedging on whether or not U.S. schools would reopen in the fall during a Wednesday interview on MSNBC. We're going to do real quick. We're going to change our articles here so that we can actually see what we are reading. We'll smooth this. Come on. Move this down. Alright, here we go. Now we can resume. Sorry about that. But let's keep going. Having previously recommended that fully vaccinated individuals are not required to wear masks, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention reversed guidelines following the spread of the new Delta variant of the virus, announcing that vaccinated people should return to wearing masks indoors and suggesting universal masking in schools. Wellington called the guidance a curveball before suggesting that school reopenings this fall are not a done deal. So the bottom line is we are going to keep kids safe, we are going to keep our members safe, and we're going to try to open up schools. And we're going to move through this political battlefield. Critics picked up on their comment about the reopening schools because it sounded like backpedaling from when she argued in May that we can and we must reopen schools in the fall. Conditions have changed, she said at the time. We can and must reopen schools in the fall for in-person teaching, learning, and support. And we must keep them fully open and safely 5 days a week. We are going to try, and she's citing the CDC mask decision as she wavers. Fox News contributor Gabe Branson said following Wellington's apparent flip-flop. And we're going to click on this and just listen to a little bit of the... Oops. Well, maybe not. It looks like that is not going to work, but that is A-okay. That's ultimately not the main focus here. We're going to scroll down just a little bit down to a next paragraph that I found interesting here. Teacher unions benefit from the back and forth reopening chaos because they can leverage the state of disorder to lobby for even more resources from taxpayers to return to normalcy, D'Angela said. Teachers unions in some districts might try to hold children's educators hostage even longer by keeping schools closed so that they continue to work from home with the same job security and pay while putting themselves in a better position in a secure additional ransom payments from taxpayers. Fox News contributor wondered if anyone outside of Fauci had done more harm to county during the pandemics besides her because of how kids have suffered from her agenda. That being the idea that kids have to wear masks and that it can stunt development and other topics similar to that. The idea of having kids wear masks. There was even the viral clip, I think we talked about it in my last podcast, where the news reporter was talking about her kid and that she had to make her kid wear a mask, yet she could not wear a mask because she was vaccinated but her kid wasn't, even though they were outside and she was walking her kid home. So a lot of people were a little bit perplexed about that whole idea on if that made any sense at all. So that was kind of in reference to the bizarre guidelines that were being suggested from Dr. Fauci at the time of that release. But all these indoor guidelines are going to make businesses come up with a interesting situation on what they're going to suggest doing or what they're going to do forward. I don't know if that made any sense at all. But some businesses have said that And we're talking about global businesses. We're talking about public businesses in a large part here, have said that they are going to allow their customers not to wear masks. And some businesses have kept up saying that they are going to require their customers to wear masks, such as Walmart, Costco, Apple, these sort of major businesses that have business fronts. And it's always been up to local businesses, private businesses, to come up with what their guidelines are going to be. And that has always kind of made sense. Such as the local grocery store chain here, H-E-B in Texas, has basically said that it's up to the customer on if they want to wear a mask or not. What they suggest that you should wear a mask. And I think it's kind of the same thing with Kroger and with probably many other major shopping centers, because ultimately they still want your business, but at the same time they want to keep their store workers safe and want to keep their store employees safe. We have a comment here on our YouTube by Doug. We're going to read this real quick. We sacrifice the life and freedom of the young to keep the feral around marginally longer. We have become vampires, no more than bat people. I think you're kind of mentioning the factor of the idea that a large part of our culture has become sheepish in nature, and many people have commented towards masks as being one of the evidence for doing so, that people are more than willing to wear a mask, even if logistically or logically it doesn't make sense in some perspectives, such as outside all by yourself on a trail. It doesn't really make much sense to wear a mask there. But if you're in public with a large group of people, it may make sense to wear a mask. That type of logic. And some people will listen to Dr. Fauci. Like, as soon as Dr. Fauci said that we should wear 2 masks, there are many people in my class that were wearing 2 masks the day after. So there are many people that are more than willing to follow orders. And you're also talking about the idea that, and I don't necessarily want to put words in your mouth, and we don't ultimately want to get too conspiratorial because we are on YouTube, and YouTube has been known to cut down a lot on more controversial content. But I think you're kind of talking about the idea that really herd immunity should have been the way to go, and not ultimately the way we took throughout this virus. So that is also an interesting point and something that has been highly debated. But we're going to go back to our business topic here on what the businesses are going to do now that the CDC has changed their guidelines again. And this is by MarketWatch. The U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention reversed its course on masking guidelines this week, and the move has important implications for retailers and other businesses. Some restaurants, for example, are already telling customers as the Delta variant spreads, no vax, no service. The CDC now recommends that people, regardless of the vaccination status, wear a mask indoors in areas where there is substantial and high transmission of COVID-19, as well as in K-12 schools in May. The agency relaxed face mask guidelines, saying it was no longer necessary for fully vaccinated individuals to wear one indoors. Speaking to reporters this week, CDC director highlighted her concerns around the highly contagious Delta variant and a considerable share of people who remain unvaccinated. She defined substantial and high transmission as 50 or more new cases per 100,000 people over a 7-day period. More than 200,000 U.S. counties, or 63% of counties, are experiencing substantial or high transmission, according to the new CDC level tracker. The reversal further signifies that the pandemic is far from over, even as many Americans go shopping again, travel, attend concerts and sporting events, and go to bars and nightclubs, activities once deemed too unsafe. Airlines require masks to be worn, but other establishments have a mixed bag of mask policies. On Wednesday, Bloomberg reported that Apple plans to require both employees and staff to wear masks from July 29th at more of half of its 270 U.S. retail stores. After carefully reviewing the latest CDC recommendations and analyzing health and safety data of your local area, we are updating our mask guidelines for your safety for your store. And Apple did not respond, We're going to scroll down just a little bit more. Businesses can require patrons to wear a mask even if they are vaccinated. Walmart and Costco are among other large retail chains that dropped mask wearing for vaccinated shoppers after the CDC issued its mask guidance in May. The companies were not immediately available for comment on whatever they were updating their mask policies. As July 26, updates to Costco's COVID-19 website, however, said its locations will follow the mask recommendations of the applicable state and local jurisdictions. A Walmart spokesperson told CNN on Wednesday that the company had followed CDC guidelines during the pandemic, adding that this one is a little more complicated due to county-by-county dissertation, but expect to hear more from us soon. So it goes on to talk a little bit more about the guidelines and what could happen and if business numbers could decrease from the idea of requiring masks again, because a lot of people have cited that these lockdowns have made markets suffer. These major retailers such as Costco, Walmart, Kroger, Apple to a large extent aren't really the businesses that suffer the most in a pandemic and economic shutdown. It is more the local restaurants and small businesses that are going to suffer than the major retail chains, because these major retail chains tend to have a larger sum of emergency money to issue than a small local business would. So what do I think is going to happen off of this? I think it's possible that Walmart and Costco could make a decision by county or by state, but I also think it's very possible that they will make a guideline that has to pass through all of their company locations. So if Walmart comes out and says that masks are now required, I think it would be likely that all Walmarts in the United States would be subject to having masks being required at their stores. I think I could see that very much happening, but it is possible that they could make a state-by-state or county-by-county decision in order to keep the majority of people ultimately affected. But I don't think that we should be so much focused on major corporations. Actually, we should be focused on small retail stores, local businesses, local restaurants, and the effect that a new mask mandate could have on the policies for those restaurants. We're going to take a quick drink break and then get into our next topic. So this next article is by Politico. And this is of the new mask mandates and mask mandate enforcement that people are talking about. And then it's going to go on to Pelosi and the hearings that have recently happened from the January 6th insurrection, or some have called Sophie Vest, depending on the angle and really what political party you identify yourself under. But we're going to first get into our Politico article. If I can start speaking. We're only 53 minutes in and I'm already having some tongue twisters, but we can get through this here. GOP lawmaker challenges McCarthy over Bull's mask mandate enforcement. Representative Chip Roy confronted House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy on Thursday about a new Capitol Police bulletin that suggests congressional staffers and visitors could be arrested if they fail to heed the chamber's new mask mandate. This is Bulls. We need to lead, Roy, a member of the conservative House Freedom Caucus, told McCarthy during a brief meeting of the GOP lawmakers in the Capitol reception room. According to the two sources familiar with the exchange, McCarthy replied to a frustrated Roy that his plan to win back the majority in 2022 and become Speaker, the sources said. Their back-and-forth illustrations the mounting fury on the right about efforts by Capitol security officials to enforce mask-wearing rules amid the surge of COVID's Delta variant. A Capitol Police guidance flare circulated that Thursday morning by Representative Kamak, representative of Florida, or Republican of Florida, states, if a visitor or staff member fails to wear a mask after a request is made to do so, the visitor or staff shall be denied entry to the House office building or the House side of the Capitol. Any person who fails to comply or leave the premises after being asked to do so will be subject to an arrest for all unlawful entry. The flare continues. The guidance made clear that members who fail to comply with the mask mandates won't be arrested, but would be reported to the House Sergeant at Arms office. Kamak tweeted the guidance that and argued that it is an abuse of power by Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Capitol Police to propose arresting staffers, even those who are vaccinated. So again, this gets to the idea, even at the start of Biden's presidency, I was talking about this, and I'm definitely not the only one to talk about this by any means, but the idea being that Biden's presidency was going to take a extremely strict perspective on COVID, probably for good reasons. You could argue of Trump's approach to the virus. Many people thought that Trump's handling of the virus was so bad. And it was the reason that it spiked in numbers and the reason that, well, the virus became political. And I think you can have some grounds and some beliefs and some truth to those statements of the virus and Trump making it more politicized. I think there is definitely some truth to that statement. But we knew from the very start that Biden was going to take the COVID virus extremely at a top concern, I should say, and was going to be very focused on trying to handle this virus and try to get a hold of it. So because of that, we knew right off the bat that he was going to be a lot more strict than a lot more soft to what was happening. And that makes sense that Pelosi, who is the leader of the House, would again decide to become strict over her handling of the virus and mask mandates. And in a way, it kind of makes sense that there would be debates on the government office through the House, through the Capitol, and through other Capitol business meeting locations than just the Capitol itself, that those would be under debate over mask mandates or not, when regular private businesses and even corporations have to debate the same thing. So it makes sense that it would be debated at the high level of the Capitol and of the government of the United States of America, and not just local businesses that have to make the same concern. But you can see that a lot of Republicans are upset about the idea that you would have to, even once vaccinated, have to wear a mask, and you could be arrested yourself or your staffer could be arrested if they fail to wear a mask despite having already been vaccinated. So once again, it kind of goes back to that, and you can see the approach of the Biden administration and approach of the government through Pelosi and other figures of making COVID a top concern and extremely focused on that. This is by Fox News. Osa Stanford calls Liz Cheney a Pelosi Pawn. Representative Elise called fellow Republican House member Liz Cheney a Pelosi Pawn after Cheney criticized Schiffer for saying the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is to blame for the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol. And when it comes to Liz Cheney, Stanford told let's take a deep breath. Alright, let's try to reread that sentence again. And when it comes to Liz Cheney, she told Sean Hannity Tuesday evening on his Fox News program she is a Pelosi Republican, a Pelosi pawn at this point. She does not represent the Republican conference or Republican voters or the American people. Stanford, who became the third-ranking House Republican after the party ousted Cheney from the position. Oh, sorry. Accidentally clicked on the wrong thing. Let's get back. Alright. deserves to know the truth, and Nancy Pelosi bears responsibility as House Speaker for the tragedy that occurred on January 6. CNN Jake Tapper later Thursday asked Cheney about the comments, leading Cheney to criticize them as shameful and blaming former President Donald Trump for the January 6 riot at the Capitol. If I were saying these things that you just played, I would be deeply ashamed of myself. What happened is absolutely clear. We had, as we heard this morning, just cruelty. A mob that was assembled by President Trump was provoked by him. He lit the flame for what happened. We have seen that not just the speech on the ellipse, but throughout. What the committee needs to understand exactly is what the details were of the planning and the financing. But for anybody to suggest that somehow he wasn't responsible, I think is shameful. Schmidt told Hannity during the Tuesday night interview, Republicans are focused on the facts. Republicans are not focused on protecting the Speaker of the House, who is a lame duck speaker. We want truth, accountability. We want to make sure that the U.S. Capitol is secure as the People's House and that the violence on January 6th never happens again, she added. Nancy Pelosi bears responsibility. We know that as early as December, there was information and intelligence that there were potential security threats at the Capitol was not going to be secure on January 6th, she added. So this goes back to the idea that Pelosi knew that the event like this in January 6th could have happened. And therefore, why was security not as big as it could have been? You could argue that President Trump himself made the security not as big, or maybe a figure from President Trump's cabinet made the security less. But you could also argue that it could have been Pelosi that decided to not make the security as big or take the threat as seriously, because she could have saw it as a political motive and a political position to keep her power in government, or whatever speculation you could say. It's hard to say with certainty which position is ultimately true. But what we do know about January 6th is that there is believed to even have some FBI involvement in it, or at least the FBI ultimately knew of, and some have taken the cynical route of saying that some FBI members could have directly been involved for the January 6th event, which is an interesting extension or an interesting highlight that has come off of the recent news stories about the January 6th event. But we're going to continue on with the whole Pelosi theme by a Newsweek article. It says, why Pelosi won't tolerate dissent on her insurrection committee. Perhaps some naive souls believed House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's decision to convince a special committee to investigate the January 6th Capitol riot would afford the county some closure on the traumatic events of that day. It appears that Pelosi has other motives. She and her party have latched onto disgraceful events of January 6th, not merely as talking points to deploy against former President Donald Trump, but as a club which to beat all Republicans who express concern about election security. 6 months after Trump's second impeachment, and following the Senate's failure to approve a 9/11 type commission, Pelosi dodged insistence on relitigating the riot, was sure to invite a debate about a host of issues, including some that don't fit nearly into Democrats' preferred narrative about an insurrection. As the riot recedes further into the past, it becomes clear if Pelosi's committee was going to amount to anything more than fuel for a CNN or MSNBC retrospective. The House Speaker was going to have to allow Trump supporters the right to take part in its proceedings and make any points they felt necessary. That would have meant allowing House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy to name that Republican who would be on the committee. But Pelosi did not grant him the right. Her response to McCarthy could not have been calculated to inflame GOP opinion and widen the partisan divide about the riot. It is certain to convince conservatives, whether adherent to Trump loyalists or to those who are array of confined involvement in politics, that the committee's goal was nothing more than political messaging. So that is what a lot of people have mentioned, because Pelosi did deny the Republican suggestions for people that should be on the committee, such as Tim Jordan was a name, and there were several other major people that were listed that the Republican House leader wanted to add to the committee from his perspective, and Pelosi denied all of those members of the Republican committee and went with her own special few that she chosen. And those special few tend to be the type of Republican people that a lot of people not necessarily want to avoid per se, but people who aren't hardcore Republican, but more Republicans that are willing to cross the aisle, which isn't necessarily a bad thing to have, but the idea that it is 100% even on both sides is definitely not the case when talking about the January 6th event. This article is about the Hill over some powerful Capitol riot testimony, mostly given by the officers and some other people. I'm going to keep this in the comments of wherever you're listening to this video or in the description of the podcast, but we are going to go directly to the videos of hearing some of that testimony that happened from the hearings yesterday, and this is mainly by the cops and one, I think, Republican member, if I am not mistaken, in his testimony about the exact things that happened during the Capitol riots. So we're going to go ahead and full screen this for those who are watching live. Make this so that we can actually see what is on the screen. And then we'll get to play our video over the testimony here. Let's make sure we can actually hear this. Come on. Alright, we look good.
Years old, and then a sergeant in the army. I had deployed to Iraq. When I was 25 years old, and then a sergeant in the army, I had deployed to Iraq for Operation Iraqi Freedom. From time to time, I volunteered to travel on IED-infested roads. But on January 6th, for the first time, I was more afraid to work at the Capitol than my entire deployment to Iraq.
I was grabbed, beat.
So once again, this is testimony given by officers who are in charge of the Capitol, are Capitol police officers. It's important to note that Capitol Police are different than DC Police. Capitol Police are deployed by the Capitol, are in charge of keeping the people who are in the Capitol staff members of senators and House members and senators themselves, and potential visitors that might be in the Capitol at that time. Now, the reason it is an insurrection is because you are not supposed to be in the Capitol, and there's obviously arguments over that itself, but that's ultimately not the focus of today's podcast or of today's video and whatnot. We can argue over the idea of it being an insurrection, but the whole concept here is that this is testimony given by officers, and you heard from the one officer there that said that he served time overseas, and I think he said Iraq, unless my ears failed me, could have been Iran, but he served overseas and was in charge of finding mines and whatnot, and that was a very scary time. But he was more scared at the January 6th event with all of the thousands of people that were outside the Capitol. And we're going to go on to hear another officer and his accounts of the event.
Beaten, tased, all while being called a traitor to my country. I was at risk of being stripped of and killed with my own firearm, as I heard chants of kill him with his own gun.
To my perpetual confusion, I saw the thin blue line flag, a symbol of support for law enforcement, more than once, being carried by the terrorists as they ignored our commands and continued to assault us.
One woman in a pink MAGA shirt yelled, "You hear that, guys? This voted for Joe Biden." Then the crowd, perhaps around 20 people, joined in screaming, "Boo!" No one had ever called me a while wearing the uniform of a Capitol police officer. More than 6 months later, January 6th still isn't over for me. I've had to avail myself of multiple counseling sessions from the Capitol Police Employee Assistance Program, and I'm now receiving private counseling therapy for the persistent emotional trauma of that day. I've also participated in many peer support programs with fellow law enforcement officers from around the United States. I know so many other officers continue to hurt, both physically and emotionally.
You guys may, individually.
So those were accounts, again, by officers, with one saying that he heard chants of kill the officer, and then other chants of racial slurs against one officer that he had heard. And obviously these are accounts by themselves and events that are more than likely to be true. We were going to hear from Representative Adam Kinzinger, I think that's how you pronounce his name, and he is a representative. So it's interesting to hear from a government official. And once again, these are video highlights off of the committee hearing.
Individually feel a little broken. You guys all talk about the effects you have to deal with, and you talk about the impact of that day. But you guys won. You guys held. Democracies are not defined by our bad days. We're defined by how we come back from bad days, how we take accountability for that. And for all the overheated rhetoric surrounding this committee, our mission is very simple. Let's define the truth, and it's to ensure accountability.
What do you think people considering becoming law enforcement officers think when they see elected leaders downplaying this? And why would I risk my life for?
Let's just put it this way. Being a cop now is something that I don't think many people really want to be at all. From the perspective of police becoming defunded, from the perspective of police just not generally being liked by anyone, really. Even people that are hardcore back the blue come from a perspective that doesn't necessarily mean 100%, excuse me, 100% that they will be your friends at the end. So being a police officer is extremely lonely, and you're surrounded with events that could potentially put your life at risk. And especially now that everything's become so controversial, some political, any arrest could potentially become something that isn't a typical arrest, especially with these most recent events that are happening. It's becoming so politically charged. And he's talking about the January 6th event and politicians that are underplaying it, and the idea that they may not want to become officers because of that. Well, I think that could be a reason, but ultimately I think if you want to be an officer, you have to come from a perspective that is so different than a typical perspective. I think you could go to say that there's no honor in being a police officer anymore. People don't look at you as a good public official. People look at you as someone that could put their life in danger and someone that could put your life at risk. They don't necessarily see you as a figure of protection like maybe they used to in the public perception. So I get what he's saying here, and I don't ultimately want to argue against everything that is being stated, but I just felt like that needed to ultimately be stated. But we're going to fast forward just a little bit and get to the next clip that I wanted to share here. We'll start it right here.
Represent.
What were you fighting for that day?
Democracy, especially with the razor-thin margins on Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate. If any single one person was kidnapped or killed, which I have no doubt in my mind is what they intended, that would affect the outcome of legislation and all your duties for years to come.
In retrospect.
So the idea, what he stated here, is that he had no doubt in his mind that the people who came in wanted to either kidnap or kill one of these officials. It's important to note that at the time of this event, what's his name? The vice president, Mike Pence, was holding a election hearing, I think it was, or election vote, ultimately, if he wanted to improve the election results. And many of the Trump supporters at the time thought that there was a chance that Mike Pence would deny the election results because of many of the theories that Trump supporters had at the time about votes. And you could argue even now they could still have the same feelings and same perspectives now. But you could say that he had no doubt in his mind that their goal was to do so. Again, I wasn't there, so you can't say for certain, but from the footage that I have seen, I find that highly unlikely. I don't necessarily think that that was the goal. Maybe that was the goal of a few people, being the very low percentage, but definitely not the goal of the majority of people, and it only takes a few people to make something tragic happen. So it is possible that there was a few people that could have potentially had something extremely bad happen. It only takes a few, but I don't necessarily think that that was the whole goal of the people that seek to do that.
Now, thinking about those events, the things that were said, it's disgraceful that members of our government, I believe, were responsible for inciting that behavior and then continue to propagate those statements. Things like, this was 1776, or that police officers who fought risked their lives, and some who gave theirs were redcoats.
So he's going to go on to talk a little bit more there, but if I'm not mistaken, I don't remember hearing about an officer who did die. I'm sure there may have been somebody, and once again, I'm not necessarily trying to disprove everything they say here. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the idea, because any way around it, whatever perspective you come in to this commission, it is extremely political in nature. So that's something I think we need to understand here. And I'm not necessarily trying to bring in my political beliefs into this. I'm trying to have a more bird's eye perspective. But you can't necessarily take everything 100% at word either. I think it's important to have a healthy amount of debate on these type of things so that we actually get to the genuine truth and not the truth that a certain person might believe. And he may be 80% true, he may even be 100% true, but it's important we at least debate and get to the truth and not just go with the words of a few people. But I could be wrong on that perspective, and I wouldn't be shocked if I was, but I also necessarily wouldn't be shocked if I wasn't. But we're just going to let him finish out his statement here. But I was just thinking, I'm like, I don't remember hearing any claims of that, but the whole thing is a political or mass media jungle to try to navigate through.
And traitors. To me, those individuals are, representative of the worst that America has to offer.
Hey, NBC News.
And we don't need to hear from you, Lester, but thank you for having the clips, NBC News, of that whole ordeal. And once again, everything is extremely political in nature, so whatever political party you associate with is probably the perspective that you're going to have coming off of this article and what you just heard from those clips. But I just thought that that was interesting and something worth sharing, so that we actually got some clips from the hearing that happened yesterday as of this recording. And by the time the podcast is released, it would be probably 2, 3, 4 days since the last topic based off of that. But we're going to go to our Fox News article just briefly here. Is Merrick Garland letting Trump's people off the hook? We're going to adjust our article a little bit for those who are viewing this live. The former federal judge has promised to restore the independence of the Justice Department after years of Trump-related controversies. But the narrative has formed that Garland is too set on moving forward and not focused enough or on bringing wrongdoers associated with the Trump administration to justice. For instance, Washington Post columnist Jennifer Rubin switched from praising Garland in May for putting justice back in the Justice Department to declaring him in June the wrong man for the job. Many in the liberal legal community have made similar critiques as the government ethics advocates. The criticism of Garland focused mainly on three different sets of issues. First, his DOJ has made certain arguments in civil lawsuits originally aimed at President Trump and his appointees. Under Garland, for instance, the department has continued defunding Trump against a defamation lawsuit from Jean Carlo. And they are trying to keep Bill Barr's deliberations over the Mueller report secret. DOJ officials argue that they are looking out for the progressives of presidency and the executive branch and correctly applying the law, but the critics say they are unretroactively defining malfeasance. Second, Garland has taken a relatively hands-off approach to reviewing potential misconduct for Trump's Justice Department. Rather than intimidating a board review himself, he's left individual issues of concern to the department's Inspector General to handle. Finally, there's a fear that the department won't aggressively pursue merited criminal investigations against Trump or his associates. This is ought to be the access since so much of the decision-making happens behind the scenes. Still, last week's indictment of Trump's campaign advisor Tom Barrack and the raids of Rudy Giuliani's home and office in April do seem to make clear there's no generalized animosity for Trump-affiliated lawbreakers. So there we have with that idea. And the idea here being that he shouldn't ultimately be focused on what may happen in the future, but should investigate the wrongdoings and crimes that Trump and the Trump administration had committed. Now, are those crimes actually true? Hard to say, and I would probably say that they are not true, or at least not as a big deal as the leftists want it to be. Or he would have go ahead and went with the charges. So ultimately, I don't really see anything wrong in what Merrick Garland is doing, because I think that his approach should be in what's happening in the future, because obviously those claims of Trump and Trump's former administrations, if they were true and were as bad as the left wants it to be, their charges would have been made official by now and would have happened. Could things behind the scenes be happening? Of course they could, and we want to know about that. But I find it very hard to believe with how polarizing Trump was as a figure. So I think that most likely he doesn't necessarily see those claims as being big enough or have enough support or have a big enough claim to pass in the law of court. And he probably wants to pass and not fail, because if he goes about charging, let's just say, Rudy Giuliani on some of his claims, then and they're false claims, then he ultimately looks really bad, and the movement to arrest Rudy Giuliani goes bankrupt. It wouldn't happen anymore. So ultimately, as a prosecutor, as someone that wants to make charges against somebody, you want those charges to be 100% genuine and true, because if they're not, it can make you look really bad. So ultimately, I don't see anything wrong in what he was doing, but I just thought it was interesting and something to bring up on this podcast. Next thing to kind of end this last topic is Mo Brooks was wearing body armor to Trump's very peaceful January 6th rally, and this was by The Slate. The idea making fun that why would you be wearing body armor if you thought that the protest was peaceful. So let's read a little bit about what they say about Representative Mo Brooks. The Alabama representative, notorious for speaking row at the January 6th leading up to the invasion of the Capitol. 1 second here. We're going to move this so that we can view this. All right, there you go. The Alabama representative, notorious for speaking row at the January 6th rally leading up to the invasion of the Capitol, did not watch Tuesday's first hearing of the House Select Committee investigations. I was blah, 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 blah. We don't care about that. We need to get into the idea here. Back in December, Brooks was the first House Republican to stay ahead of the Congressional Electoral College certification that he would object to certain state electors on the day of the certification on January 6. He then gave a fiery speech at Donald Trump's rally at the Eclipse, where he told the assembled crowd that today is the day America patriots start taking down names and kicking ass. Months later, he still argues that Trump would have won the election if only lawful votes were counted. And by the way, YouTube, only lawful votes were counted. Anyway, Brooks' support of Trump's efforts to overturn the election successively earned him the former president's endorsement in 2022 Alabama Senate race, but it has also earned him legal issues. California Representative Eric Swalwell sued Brooks and others, blah 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 blah. That's why I was... Okay, here we go to the armor part. This is the interesting part. I was warned on Monday that there might be risks associated with the next few days, he said. And as consequence of those warnings, I did not want to go to my condo. Instead, I slept on the floor of my office, and when I gave the speech, I was wearing body armor. That's why I was wearing that nice little windbreaker, he told me with a grin, to cover up the body armor. He didn't say who warned him or the risk that was to be warned about. There were probably a half dozen different motivations that affected people in various degrees. So it just talks about why would you be wearing body armor if you're a hardcore supporter of Donald Trump, and if you thought that the event would be peaceful, then why would you wear body armor? And that being kind of the major debate there. Just kind of something funny, and obviously it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out why he would wear body armor, even if you thought that the protests were peaceful.
If you're suffering from neuropathy, I would say give...
Sorry about that. Good old autoplay ad on the Hill's website. Thank you, Hill. We don't necessarily need to hear about your medical condition. Thank you very much. But anyway, as I was saying, it doesn't take a rocket science, even if you thought that the protests were 100% peaceful, to just stay extra precautious in the idea of wanting to keep yourself as safe as possible. The next thing we're talking about here is Vice President Kamala Harris' bad polls, and it triggers some Democratic worries. Vice President Harris has some ground to make up in order to be perceived as more favorable by the public. 6 months ago and into office, polls indicate Harris is viewed less favorably than President Biden. She has also made some tactical missteps outside of her White House that Democrats say show she isn't quite yet found her bearings. Vice President historically do not outperform the leader at the top of the ticket, but her lower ratings haven't gone unnoticed. In a trio of recent surveys, Harris earned a combined unfavorable rating of 46%, according to the aggregate average combined by Real Clear Politics. That number is 3 points below President Biden's 43% in the same category. In an Economist YouGov poll conducted from July 24th to 27th, Harris' unfavorable figure reached 48%. A midterm visit by the vice president to a congressional district is generally a way to create crowds and win attention for candidates. But Harris' polling numbers are raising questions about how she might be used as a Democratic seek to hold to slim majorities in the House and Senate. Because once again in 2022 is the election and could seek the House overturning to a Republican, and usually it does turn a different way. Sorry about that, got distracted. As of right now, I think that she has the potential of doing more harm than good for some of these candidates, said one Democratic strategist. My sense is she will probably raise a lot of money, and maybe she will go to some specific districts, but they will have to really be strategic with her. So the idea of just throwing Kamala Harris at a district or at voters isn't necessarily the right approach and something that Democrats should do. Anybody with 2 brain cells knows that Kamala Harris isn't exactly the most likable figure. Even at the time of her running as president, she eventually had to step out way before President Biden. Biden didn't step out, but way before the election was set in stone. Kamala Harris stepped out of the race. She was one of the earliest members to do so, even though she attacked President Biden in one of the political debates that got her some attention, but in a large part didn't really go much anywhere. But just something I bring up because I think it's funny that she's now the vice president of somebody she attacked his character towards. But once again, that's modern day politics, so not too much in there. But long story short, it is interesting that the president and vice president both have really bad ratings and could potentially, as the article mentioned, be something to be concerned with for the Democrats in 2022 with the midterm elections. We also have a New York Post article on the same thing, so if you want some more information on these polls and the Kamala Harris strategy to the border and why that's gaining some bad attention, you can look at that article if you choose to do so. But we're going to move on to our next topic and last topic, and that being the bipartisan infrastructure bill that just recently got passed. We'll take a quick drink break and then we'll get into our CBC News article. Senate votes to move forward with the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Washington. The Senate voted to move forward on bipartisan infrastructure bill after weeks of negotiations on Wednesday, clearing a procedural hurdle on a bill that includes $550 billion in new spending for infrastructure projects around the county. The vote to advance legislation Wednesday night was 67-32, with 17 Republicans joining Democrats in voting in favor. 60 votes were required to move the bill forward. The text of the proposal had not yet been released when the vote took place. As recently as this week, negotiations over the proposal appeared on the brink of collapse, but Senate Republicans announced earlier Wednesday that they had reached an agreement with the White House and Senate Democrats over the major issues in the bill. The proposal includes some of President Biden's top domestic priorities and provides billions of dollars in funding for bridges, roads, broadband internet, clean water, public transit, and more over the next 5 years. It encapsulates so-called hard infrastructure and is separate from Democratic efforts to pass a $3.5 trillion package for so-called soft infrastructure, which includes policies like Medicare expansion and universal child care. According to a White House fact sheet, the legislation includes, and we go on, $40 billion for bridge repair, replacement, and rehabilitation, $66 billion investments in Amtrak passenger rail, $39 billion for modernizing public transit and improving access for the elderly and people with disabilities, $55 billion for clean water investments, $65 billion in broadband internet deployment, and $7.5 billion to build electric vehicle chargers nationwide. And you might be wondering, well, who is in charge of all of this infrastructure? And that would be Mr. Pete Buttigieg. You remember my man Pete Buttigieg, the Democrat candidate who was popular for his double masking, and Fauci then went with his double mask stance. The guy who got challenged by in his mayor race by someone that was running, or his re-election for mayor, by somebody who was running for potholes because Pete Buttigieg did such a bad job with roads and potholes that one of the things that his other candidate was running for was pothole management. Oh yeah, that guy. He is in charge of this infrastructure bill and massive amounts of money, and we're going to get into what he had to say later on. But let's just move on to the 17 Republicans that were a part of this major infrastructure bill and are responsible for more information that is going to come here in the future. This is by CNN, as it states, here are the 17 Republican senators who voted to advance the $1 trillion infrastructure bill. We're going to scroll down past all their autoplays here. Roy Blunt of Missouri, Richard Moore of North Carolina, Shelby Moore of West Virginia, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, Susan Collins of Maine, of course Susan, Kevin Creamer of North Dakota, Mike Crapo of Idaho, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. Lindsey Graham, interesting. Anyway, Chuck Grassley, whatever his name is, of Iowa. John, Mitch McConnell of Kentucky is also an interesting one. Lisa of Alaska, Bob Portman of Ohio, Jim Risk of Idaho, Mitt Romney, another, of course. Mitt Romney and Susan Collins are the main ones that tend to vote along Democratic lines on things. Tom Tillis of North Carolina, and Todd Young of India. I don't know a lot of those people and their personal stances, but I've mentioned some of the ones that I thought were rather interesting there. But I thought it was interesting to read the people that were in favor of this. Not necessarily that it is 100% a bad thing, but let's hear from the man who is going to be in charge of this new money and in charge of the transportation and infrastructure of Pete Buttigieg being the cabinet member responsible for that. I think I've already said that, but it never hurts to repeat 2, 3, 4, 8, 9, 20, 40 times throughout this podcast. So we're just going to resize everything for those who are viewing live, and then we'll get into hearing this video and what Pete Buttigieg plans to do with this money. And once again, I would mention that the guy who ran against Pete Buttigieg in his mayor race was running for potholes because Pete Buttigieg did such a bad job with potholes in his local city. In his local city. I just find it incredibly funny that he is now in charge of infrastructure and in charge of transportation.
All right, Secretary Buttigieg, my question is on timing. How long do you think it will take to do the projects that you've just outlined, get the regulatory approvals and cut through the red tape? Because we did learn in 2009 that there is no such thing as shovel-ready projects.
Well, as I visit communities across the country, talk to mayors, transit authority leaders, governors, what I'm seeing is that there are some things that...
His official job is called Transportation Secretary. That's why she called him Secretary. He is not President Biden's direct secretary. Not that that makes any difference, but we'll continue on with what he has to say here.
They could hit go on tomorrow. Some things are even already underway. They just go faster if they had more funding. Other things are going to take longer. And I want to emphasize this is a little bit different than the 2009 bill. That was a stimulus. That was about getting out of an economic hole. This is about preparing the economy for the future. And so there's a focus not just on shovel-ready projects that we could be working on literally immediately as soon as that funding clears, but also what I would call shovel-worthy projects, projects that are going to define what it is like to live in the United States in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s, but that we got to get to work on right this minute because, frankly, we've allowed this country to fall behind.
So infrastructure has been something that has been going downhill. A lot of people debate, and it's one of the common things against the whole idea of libertarian philosophy is the idea of, well, who's going to build the roads if you don't have government? Because where's the motivation to do so if you don't have government? And most libertarians tend to point out the idea that if something needs to be done, it will be done. After all, Domino's Pizza was able to manage to fill in potholes. They didn't make an entirely new road, but they did something a lot of local governments and even government as a whole has not been doing recently, which is kind of funny. And the reason you bring up all of that is the idea of giving the government more money, especially with infrastructure, doesn't necessarily seem like a bad idea maybe right away, especially if you're someone that doesn't think that roads would be built without the government's involvement in things similar to that type of topic. I would disagree with you on that, but if you are someone that thinks that, it's also important to note that government tends to be incredibly inefficient with the money that they do have, and I yet to see good results coming from it. So I'm needless to say, I am not in support for the amount of money that is being used for this infrastructure. Pete Buttigieg can prove me wrong, but I highly doubt that that is going to happen with the plans. Are his ideas good? Are his motivations good? Probably so. but the way it's going to be done and the practicality of it is something that I struggle with, and we're ultimately going into an incredibly bad economy, and we need to fix that fast. Now, will better infrastructure lead to the problem of our economy and the deflation of the dollar? Will that make things better? Potentially, but we have yet to see it. And I just have high speculations about the whole ordeal and the whole idea of this. But let's see what else he has to say.
Let's just be clear, though. I mean, you said the president wants both packages, physical and human. Will he sign one without the other? Because that remains an open question.
Well, obviously, there's a question about how Congress is going to proceed and how the kind of procedural mechanics work. And we leave that to Congress, and we trust the leadership to go ahead and bring those forward. But the president's going to keep his word. He believes in this bipartisan deal. And of course, he believes in the rest of his economic vision. And again, I'm just going to say it one more time. I think there's no reason why at least a few Republicans shouldn't be willing to support things like paid family leave in this country, or free community college, or making sure 3- and 4-year-olds can go to pre-K, or making sure that it's affordable to have childcare no matter your income in this country. I'm going to continue pushing for that to be bipartisan too, but
so he goes on to talk about those points, and ultimately, we could have a whole episode just on that last thing he had to say there. Not ultimately that they are bad goals to have, bad motivations to have by any means, but that's just something you could have a whole conversation about. And ultimately, I don't really feel like having that conversation now, but I will say in short a summary about all of those. It ultimately comes down, the idea between a Democrat and a Republican, to me, comes down to this. Democrats tend to go for ideas. They want to make free college, free health care, be a practicality in the land of the free in America. They think that every American should have the right of free college. And the idea is very good. Like, the idea of free college and letting everybody have the opportunity for college is something that we should seek to do. It's something that is important. But it then comes down to, well, where is that money going to come from? How is it practical to do that? And Republicans are on that side of the spectrum. They always ask those questions when it comes to ideas. And sometimes Republicans can be too focused on those questions. They'll keep asking why, and they won't ever try to change what's happening. And you ultimately have to have some change in order to improve the America that exists today. In order to improve on things, you can't necessarily be fully grounded and just ask why always. You do have to seek to improve, and you do have to seek to new ideas. And that's ultimately the difference between the two major parties there. And then, of course, you have third-party stances from within that, and we can get into those later. But once again, ultimately, I don't think we necessarily need to argue about that at the end of today's podcast. But I thought that was a good way to end with, and I highly appreciate anybody who stopped by live, Jimmy, Corvo, and Doug. Yeah, Doug. I thought I was Doug. I appreciate you, Jimmy, Corvo, and Doug, for stopping by on the live stream. And thank you, anybody who is watching this as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever else you may be listening to your podcast from. I'm sorry that it took us over a month to get a new podcast up, but I hope you liked this episode, and you will stay tuned for next week for our 30th episode, where we discuss the news of that week. Highly appreciate all of you, and I hope you all have good days, good nights, good evenings, or good mornings, and whatever time you are listening to